Narratology is a study of how stories are structured and how they create meaning. Narratology developed from structuralism, but it later became an independent field. Since it uses many ideas and terms from linguistics, it is closely connected to stylistics. However, while stylistics studies language in text, narratology studies how stories are built. To explain narratology, think about a restaurant menu. Instead of simply saying cod and chips, the menu might describe it as fresh caught, succulent North Sea cod in golden batter with delicious French fries. In the catering business, such descriptions are sometimes called narratives. However, the menu may add a note saying that these descriptions are only guidelines and should not be taken literally. This difference between the actual meal and the attractive description is similar to an important idea in narratology. Narratologists make a key difference between story and plot. The story is the sequence of events as they really happen in chronological order with nothing left out. The plot, on the other hand, is how those events are arranged and presented in the narrative. A plot may begin in the middle of events, use flashbacks to describe earlier happenings, or even hint at future events. In short, the plot is the shaped and an organized version of the story. Different critics use different terms for this same distinction. The Russian formalists use the word fabula for story and Zouche for plot. Some North American critics prefer the term discourse instead of plot because it includes not just events but also style, viewpoint, and pace. Janet used the terms histor, meaning story, and recit, meaning plot. Even though the terminology changes, the basic idea remains the same. Narratology studies how stories are structured and presented. Aristotle, in his book Poetics, explains what makes a good story, especially in tragedy. Every story has two main parts, character and action. We understand a character not just by description but by what they do. Character is revealed through the plot. Aristotle identifies three important elements in a plot. They are hamartia, meaning a fault or mistake. In tragedy, this is often the hero's tragic flaw, a weakness that causes problems. Anagnorisis, meaning a moment of recognition or realization. This is when the hero understands an important truth, often about themselves. Third, peripeteia, reversal of fortune. This is when the hero's situation suddenly changes, usually from good to bad. Aristotle developed these ideas by studying many Greek tragedies and noticing what they had in common. Like a scientist finding patterns in nature, he looked for common elements in different stories. We can even see these three elements in very simple stories. For example, imagine a cartoon story about a cat. The cat jumps onto a table and leaves dirty paw prints on the tablecloth. This is the hamartia, the mistake. Because of this, the cat is scolded and sent down from the table. This is the peripeteia, the fall from a good position to a bad one. Later, a visiting aunt is happy to see that her gift, a tablecloth, is being used. The cat's owner realizes she should have used the tablecloth earlier to show appreciation. This realization is the anagnorisis. As a result, the cat is forgiven and allowed to sit happily on the owner's lap again. This is another peripeteia, but this time a positive reversal from low status back to high status. This example also shows something important about storytelling. Information is often delayed. Sometimes readers know things that characters do not. Writers control when information is given. This delay creates interest and suspense. The novelist Wilkie Collins once said that the secret of storytelling is make them laugh, make them cry, make them wait. Aristotle's ideas mainly focus on the deeper moral meanings of stories, inner faults, recognition, and consequences. While his system explains moral patterns, it does not fully explain the many different kinds of plots. Another important narratologist is Vladimir Prop. He was a Russian formalist critic who studied Russian folk tales. In his famous book, The Morphology of the Folktale, published in 1928, he tried to discover the basic structure behind these stories. The word morphology means the study of forms. So, Prop was studying the form and structure of folk tales, not their history or social meaning. Prop studied 100 Russian folk tales. After examining them carefully, he concluded that all of them were built from a basic list of 31 possible actions, which he called functions. A function is something that happens in the story, such as a villain causing harm, a hero leaving home, or a hero defeating the villain. Not every story contains all 31 functions, but every story uses some of them. Most importantly, the functions always appear in the same order. For example, in many tales, a villain first gathers information about the hero, then tricks the hero, then harms someone. Later, the hero receives help, often magical, fights the villain, defeats him, and finally marries and becomes king. A story might skip some steps, but it cannot change the order. The villain cannot be punished before he is defeated. Prop believed this fixed order shows that beneath many different stories, there is a shared structure. Even though stories look very different on the surface, they are built from the same basic pattern. Prop also identified seven main spheres of action, which are like roles in a story. These roles are the villain, the donor, who gives help or a magical object, the helper, the princess or person being sought, and her father, the dispatcher who sends the hero on the quest, the hero and the false hero. These are not always separate characters. Sometimes one character plays more than one role. For example, the villain may also pretend to be a hero. More than one character can share the same role. For Prop, action is more important than character. Characters mainly exist to carry out the functions. In this way, Prop is similar to Aristotle, who also believed that action is more important than character in storytelling. However, Prop's system has some problems. Some of his functions seem to describe the same event from different points of view. For example, when a villain deceives a victim, this could be seen as one action rather than two separate functions. Also, his system works best for simple folk tales, not for complex modern novels. For example, in the psychological novels of Henry James, characters are not clearly good or evil. James once said he wrote about good and evil, meaning that people are often a mixture of both. In such stories, roles like hero and villain are not easy to define. Prop system also does not explain how a story is told, its style, tone, or point of view. Later narratologists focus more on these aspects. Still, Prop's work remains very important because it shows that many different stories share a common deep structure. One of the most important modern narratologists after Roland Barthes is Jennett. In his book Narrative Discourse, published in 1972, he does not focus mainly on the story itself but on how the story is told. He studies the techniques and methods of narration. He talks about two basic ways of telling a story: mimesis and diegesis. Mimesis means showing. In this mode, events are presented like a scene in a play. We see where the characters are, we hear their direct speech, and we feel as if we are watching the action happen. This is slow storytelling. Diegesis means telling. In this mode, the narrator quickly summarizes events. Instead of showing every detail, the narrator simply tells us what happened. Most novels use both methods. Writers often summarize long periods of time, diegesis, and then slow down to describe an important scene in detail, mimesis. Second, he explains focalization, which means point of view. Who sees or experiences the events? In external focalization, we only see what can be observed from outside, such as actions and spoken words. We do not know the character's thoughts. In internal focalization, we enter a character's mind and learn their feelings and thoughts. If the narrator can move freely into the minds of all characters, this is called zero focalization, also known as omniscient narration. Third, he asks who is a narrator. Sometimes the narrator is not a character in the story and has no clear identity. This is called a covert or non dramatized narrator. In other cases, the narrator is a character with a name and personality. For example, Mr. Lockwood in Wuthering Heights, Marlowe in Heart of Darkness, and Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby are narrators inside the story. If the narrator tells their own story, this is called homodiegetic narration. If they tell someone else's story, it is heterodiegetic narration. Fourth, Janet studies how time works in narrative. Stories often move backward and forward in time. A flashback is called analepsis. A flash forward is called prolepsis. For example, in A Tale of Two Cities, the image of spilled wine early in the novel hints of future bloodshed. Many stories begin in the middle of the events, in media res, and then explain earlier events through flashbacks. Fifth, Janet examines how stories are structured through frame narratives. A frame narrative is a story within a story. In The Turn of the Screw, the main's ghost story is told inside a Christmas gathering. In Heart of Darkness, Marlowe tells a story while sitting with other sailors. Frames can return at the end, double-ended, or not, single-ended. Sometimes the frame interrupts the main story to remind readers of the narrator's presence. Finally, he discusses how speech and thought are presented. Writers can use direct speech, I have to go, she said, or indirect speech, she said she had to go, or free indirect speech, which mixes the narrator's voice with the character's thoughts. These choices affect how close readers feel to the characters. Overall, Janet shows that storytelling is not just about what happens, but about how it is presented. What narratologists do? Narratologists look at individual narratives, seeking out the recurrent structures which are found within all narratives. They switch much of the critical attention away from the mere content of the tale, often focusing instead on the teller and the telling. They take categories derived mainly from the analysis of short narratives and expand and refine them so that they are able to account for the complexities of novel length narratives. Narratologists counteract the tendency of conventional criticism to foreground character and motive by foregrounding instead action and structure. They derive much of their reading pleasure and interest from the affinities between all narratives rather than from the uniqueness and originality of a small number of highly regarded examples.